Book, it is the only book where God does not play a role, at least not directly attributed in the book of Ruth. In fact, at the time that the Bible was being put together, there was kind of a controversy whether the book of Ruth should be included or not. And the council that was putting this together decided that it certainly was, and I'm glad they did. The story begins by telling us that it was the time of the judges. First thing you need to know that before Israel had a king, they had a bunch of powerful lay leaders called judges. And mostly they were the leaders of some of the 12 tribes of Israel from the most powerful tribes, and they just kind of asserted themselves. And if you read the book of Judges, it will take you through the history some night if you can't sleep. And after each one, it'll tell you who the judge was, and then it'll tell you either this. It'll say, and so did right in the eyes of the Lord. What do you think that means? He was a pretty good judge. And then sometimes, more often than not, it says, and so did right in the eyes of themselves. And that was not right in the eyes of the Lord, and not a very good judge. And so there was an interesting thing going on at this time. The law that was given to Moses, that he shared with the Israelites, they had turned the law into a series of requirements and rewards. If you do this, then you will do this. It's like a checklist. It did not inhabit their hearts. It inhabited their minds. And they would try to figure out how they could work the law to their favor. So it wasn't a great time for the nation of Israel. And there was a particular woman, her name was Ruth, and she was from Moab. And in fact, whenever she comes up in the book of Ruth, they call her Ruth the Moabite. And they do that to emphasize that she had no standing within the Israelite nation. She was a foreigner. And Ruth and her sister Orpah, which, by the way, if you didn't know, Oprah Winfrey's real given birth name was Orpah. She didn't like that, apparently. So she went all the way to Oprah. These two sisters married two brothers that came from the land of Judah, from Bethlehem. But it goes out of its way in the book of Ruth to tell you that they were Ephraimites. Now, Ephraim was kind of a second-class citizen of the 12 tribes. It was not one of the original 12 brothers. It was one of Joseph's grandsons. And they were always kind of looked askant at. And they did not receive land when all the land was being divvied up for the 12 tribes of Israel. And so you can imagine there was a famine in the land of Egypt, or in the land of Israel. And who is a famine hurt the most? The people who don't have land, the people who are most vulnerable. And so a guy named Elimelech and his wife left Bethlehem in search of food. Now the word Bethlehem, literally, the name of Bethlehem means it's Beit Lahem, and Beit is the word for house. So whenever you see Beth-El, that would be the house of the Lord. Beit Lahem is bread. So Bethlehem literally means the house of bread, which, if you think about Jesus being the bread of life, he was born in the bakery, which is Bethlehem. But it's kind of ironic that here two Ephraimites have to leave the house of bread in order to find food in a foreign country because of a famine. And so they do. And they have two little sons that are with them, and the sons marry Ruth and Orpah. And then years later, Elimelech dies and leaves his wife, Naomi, with the two sons and their families. Still pretty good situation, but then both sons die. And it leaves these three women there. And at this time, it was very difficult if you were a woman without a husband. You had no real way to make any money. You had to beg. You had to rely on the kindness of strangers. It was a complete vulnerability on your part. And so Naomi says, all right, girls, here's what's going to happen. You're going to go back to your people in Moab. I'm going to go back to my people in Bethlehem. And you're both young, you can remarry. Hopefully you'll figure it out, and I will be fine. And so Orpah jumps at the chance and goes off and apparently finds, we don't know what happens to her. But Ruth says, no, I'm going to stay. In fact, I'm going to be with you. And your people will be my people. And your God will be my God. Your land will be my land. And so she ties herself to her mother-in-law. A very, very vulnerable thing to do. We assume she did it out of love and kindness, knowing that if she left, her mother-in-law would have very little recourse. Probably would not even be able to make the long trip from Moab back to Bethlehem. But together they make the trip, and when they arrive there is where our scripture begins today. That was all the first chapter of Ruth. Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth and the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose sight I may find favor. So part of the law of Moses said that if you have a field, you need to leave the edges and the corners of your field so that if there was someone who didn't have land, a foreigner or a refugee or an orphan or a widow, they would have the ability to come and glean some of the harvest that you had put in the ground. It was part of the law of Moses. And so they were relying on that. She said to her, go, my daughter. So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was the family of Elimelech. Just then Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered, how did you know that? The Saturday group said, and also with you. But no, it's the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, to whom does this young woman belong? The young woman who was in charge of the reapers answered, she is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab, she said. Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers. So she came, and she has been on her feet from early this morning until now, without resting even for a moment. Then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field, or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped, and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young women have drawn. Then she fell prostrate with her face to the ground and said to him, why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner? But Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. How you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. Then she said, "May I continue to find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, even though I am not one of your servants." So this is an interesting story about kindness and loyalty in the face of great vulnerability. Ruth was taking a humongous chance, going out by herself, a foreigner in a foreign land, to a field full of men working in the fields. We know this is a risk because as soon as Boaz comes, he orders his men not to touch her. And yet, out of a love and loyalty for her mother-in-law, she showed up. She put herself at great risk. And the first one to call Ruth not the Moabite, but my daughter, is Boaz. Daughter was a very special, sacred Jewish word, term for daughters of Israel. When a woman touches Jesus' cloak as he's walking through, he turns and he says, "Daughter of Israel," because he knew that she knew who he was, the expected Messiah. This story makes me wonder, who are the most vulnerable people in our lives? Do you know people who are going through a rough period, maybe feeling vulnerable, feeling maybe their health isn't good, or maybe they're in the midst of crisis? Just like God was speaking to Ruth, speaking to Naomi, speaking to Boaz, and calling them to be the best version of themselves, to be kind, to show and share kindness. God is calling us to remember the most vulnerable, the weak, in ways that we can use what we have, the gifts that we have, to reach out. Amen.